Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on our first Alberta North chapter Lunch and Learn for the season. We're so excited to kick it off today with Charlotte and Melanie from GoodWorks. And I know we have a lot of Alberta North, but we also have some guests from across the country. So thank you so much to our guests that are joining us from elsewhere. And we're really excited to have Charlotte and Melanie today helping us understand a bit more about marketing to the legacy giving millennial audience. As we know, obviously across the country, but a lot in Alberta, our demographics are a little bit different. We skew younger. We learned, if anyone was in our previous year seminars, we learned from Environics that Alberta is significantly has the largest population is millennial audience. So in our world of legacy giving, this poses a little bit of a different challenge to us than it does maybe across some of the other provinces. So awesome to hear from Charlotte and Melanie today. I know you guys can introduce yourselves, so I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us on your almost lunch hour, soon to become your actual lunch hour. Um, my name is Charlotte Field. Hello. I am a partner here at GoodWorks, and I've been with the agency for 10 years. Those of you who aren't familiar, GoodWorks is a full-service fundraising agency. We're based out of Ottawa, Ontario. So if you're in Alberta, I'm 3 hours ahead of you. It's 1:30 for me. I was born in 1992, which makes me feel uncomfortable sometimes, but sorry. So I am firmly a millennial, and right now I am binging. Someone in the chat said they felt vulnerable sharing that they were watching Selling Sunset, but I don't feel any shame about that at all. I love watching Selling Sunset. So that is what I am currently binging at the moment.
My name is Melanie Scholz. I'm a director of client experience also at GoodWorks. I just celebrated my sixth work anniversary. So have been with GoodWorks for 6 years. I was born in 1986, so I am what I like to say an elder millennial. I just finished binging The Perfect Couple, which I think is like some of the best TV I've seen in a few years. So highly recommend.
Like how much you and I are just like reality television. It lives on Netflix.
Perfect Couple isn't reality television.
Well, doesn't it kind of have the vibe though?
A little bit. Okay, let's break down the next 60 minutes just to give you an idea of what you're going to hear from us over the next hour. We are talking about the reactive will maker. And in order to talk about the reactive will maker, we unfortunately have to talk about COVID. We are going to talk about the psychology of next-gen legacy prospects. And also we'll wrap up by sharing some legacy marketing strategies and tactics that we recommend or that we know can work the best with this next gen donor. I know that everybody's on screen, so feel free to either raise your hand throughout the presentation or throw your question into the chat. Charlotte and I are going to take turns talking, so we can also stop at any point and answer questions. We don't want you to wait until the end, though our presentation certainly won't take all 60 minutes. We have built in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so worth of questions. So whatever, we're very informal if you can't already tell. So please don't hold on to your questions if you don't want to. Raise your hand and we'll certainly answer questions as we go.
And as Christy mentioned, the reason that we're here talking about what we're calling those next gen legacy donors. So for us, that's millennials and Gen X. It's just easier to sort of bring them together, and they have a lot of similarities from a behavioral science perspective. So we sort of vibe them together here. And why we're talking about that for this particular CAGP chapter is because, as Christy's observed, the population distribution in Alberta skews younger. We see this big old bar graph with the big, huge yellow line for millennials, way, way more substantial than anywhere else. We just see this really great big distribution of that group of people. So it makes a lot of sense to be having those discussions for you about how are we going to activate and capitalize on these younger people from a legacy perspective? So if we're going to talk about next gen legacy giving, if we're going to talk about millennial and Gen X donors in a legacy context, we have to start that conversation by talking about COVID. This is what totally changes the game from we're talking about millennials and legacy giving as like sort of trendy, sort of interesting. Oh, this is what people kind of want to talk about. Maybe it doesn't really have a lot of legs yet. Maybe it's not really getting a lot of traction. COVID happens and completely changes the way that wills are being made, the way that gifts are being made, and the way that younger people are starting to interact with both will making and legacy giving. And so that's kind of where we have to start the conversation. Some of you might be familiar with the State of the Legacy Nation report that Good Works puts out. We do it about every 4 years. By happy accident, the last one we did was 2023, and the one prior to that was 2019. So that gave us kind of a nice snippet of the before and the after. But the State of the Legacy Nation is a piece of research that we do in collaboration with Environics. And we survey Canadian donors, English-speaking Canadian donors, to understand their will-making behaviors and their legacy-giving behaviors, typically in an effort to get a good estimation of the legacy marketplace and the revenue pipeline to come. So what does it look like today and what's it going to look like in the future? When we compared our 2019 and 2023 reports, what we found is that the number of Canadians who had wills had risen from 42% to 52%. So in that period of time, more than half of Canadians now had wills in place. Also from our research, we know that of the wills that are in place right now, 10% of them were newly created in those early years of the pandemic. So I'll call that 2020, 2021, early 2022. And another 20% of the wills that are in place were updated in that time. So people had wills, they went in, they made changes. So we see this really strong correlation between overall growth in will making and a big will making motivator, which in this case was the pandemic. And it's that first group, that sort of middle group on your slide that we're going to talk about today. That's our reactive will maker. You're about to get to know them very, very well, because when we're talking about next gen legacy prospects, we're really talking about these folks. And the reason is that they came at legacy giving and will making from a totally different brain place, mental state, emotional state even, than your historical will maker. So we've traditionally talked about what we would call the reflective will maker. That's a person who is reflecting on their lives. They're firmly in the third act of their lives, which we typically say is, 60 plus. Another slightly less, I guess, pithy way to say it is when we're attending more funerals than weddings, or when we're attending funerals of our peers, we start to really be firmly ensconced in that third act of life. And we're starting to get a little bit more comfortable with our own mortality. And we're starting to think about the life that we've led. How are we going to be remembered? We've, in that stage of life, we've accumulated wealth. We probably have fewer dependents in our lives who rely upon us. And so will making for the reflective, yes, the slides will be made available, of course. Great question. That will making came from a place of reflection, satisfaction, hopefully peace, optimism, that sort of deep introspection about the life that one has led and how satisfied we are with it. And then also the way that we'd like to be remembered and what we'd leave behind. Totally different from the reactive will maker, who is not at all motivated by things like the birth of a grandchild or downsizing the home. Instead, they were motivated by potentially the end of the world as we know it. This was will making that was fear driven, that was sadness driven, that felt very urgent. And these are wills that were primarily being made by people who are in their second act of life. So for the most part, these are people who are in the process of building wealth. Their cost of living is probably fairly high because they have dependents, especially for that sandwich generation, your Gen Xers. They have probably kids in the home and they're potentially supporting parents. I can remember when I had my daughter in 2020, sitting down with my husband to make our first will and having to have the very real discussion about what we were going to do if all of our parents died. That was how things felt 5 months into the pandemic. And so that was the state of mind for the reactive will maker. And Mel will sort of explain how that would impact legacy giving, because we saw a big increase in wills. We didn't necessarily see that come through in legacy gifts yet.
Yeah, before we move on, I think a really key concept to speak about here is that concept of death avoidance. It's really important, especially within this new group of the reactive will makers. The thing is, your traditional prospects for planned giving, as Charlotte had kind of mentioned, were generally older. They're entering what we call the third stage of life. The idea of death is not something that is totally terrifying or absolutely nauseating. So they have a lower death avoidance. You can talk about it a little bit more freely. So when we're talking about gifts and wills with these folks, with these older folks, it's a little bit more simpler because you can kind of speak pretty frankly about it, and they have that more of an openness to it. But millennials are scared to talk about death. The death avoidance in this group is much higher. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes our brain shut down. We really, truly don't want to think about it. I mean, similarly to Charlotte, as many people do when they have children, they made their first will. My husband and I were sitting down with our lawyer when I had my boys, and I was in tears talking about where do the boys go if something happens to us. And my lawyer kept telling me, talking about death isn't going to make you die. He was really used to talking to millennials like myself, talking us off the edge when we're making these types of decisions. So in short, it's just really important to remember that we can't talk about death in the same way when marketing to next gen donors than we could to our, traditional legacy prospects. And as Charlotte mentioned, we saw in the research that the number of people with wills went up, but what went down, interestingly, is that the proportion of those wills with legacy gifts dropped from 17% to 10%. So you're seeing more wills, but less with legacy gifts within them. Why? Well, first of all, a lot of these older people, unfortunately, there was some mortality in COVID. A lot of these gifts ended up actually being realized in those years, just because people died and their gifts were, given to their charities. But primarily, the reason goes back to that motivator behind making their will. These people, again, were making their wills because they were scared they were going to die. They were scared the world was ending. Thinking about charity was really the last thing on their list. Their primary motivator for making a will was not to, reflect upon their life and create a legacy. It was truly like, what's going to happen to my kids? What do I want to happen to my house? Et cetera, et cetera. So they really just weren't thinking about charitable gifts. But what's really important to think about right now is that these are folks that will become ready. So in marketing to these younger folks, you're not going to get them to go tomorrow to update their will. What your strategy needs to include, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is you need to be top of mind when those donors, those next gen donors, go to make the second or third iteration of their will. So in keeping with the theme and giving you a Netflix inspired metaphor, if reflexive legacy marketing was like Bridget Jones and really looking to settle down, reactive legacy marketing is about love that grows slowly, that friends to lovers romance that we saw in When Harry Met Sally.
I'm muted, but I started talking first. The worst. As we start to think about exploring and actively marketing with that younger next gen audience, there are some impacts that we're going to feel in terms of revenue and forecasting and KPIs that it's worth talking about early on, particularly if you're, talking to your board trying to get investment, and you're trying to make that case, because things are going to look a little different. We were traditionally talking to donors who were in their 60s and 70s, and the average Canadian life expectancy is 82 years of age. If we're now talking with people who at their youngest are 28, the oldest sort of people in this demographic are just coming into that third act 60 plus year age cohort, you're looking at a much longer time to realize than we've had historically. And so that is going to have an impact on basically everything that we do and measure in legacy giving. First and foremost, it's going to impact the way we forecast revenue in a couple of ways. The obvious one is that your longer time to realize is going to lengthen you're going to have longer times to realization. So between the time that the gift is made potentially and the gift actually comes through, or in other words, the donor dies, they have a lot of life ahead of them. If you're looking at gifts that are being made in people's 40s and 50s, they're going to live a lot longer. But there's some other sort of interesting impacts that maybe are not quite so obvious on the face. One is that legacy donors tend to give more generously on an annual basis. So once there's a gift included in the will, we typically see the average gift increase. And if we have a longer time to realization, you also have a longer period of time to benefit from that annual increase. If you are a planned giving department or a planned giving team or planned giving person, team of one, who is looking for ways to work more closely with annual giving and you're looking for opportunities to integrate, that piece of information can be a huge boon for you, a great selling point. Just by virtue of including annual donors in your planned giving marketing, you will increase annual revenue as you drive more legacy giving. So a great way to keep in mind that these things are all integrated, that donors don't see themselves in silos. And so we want to be taking that full programmatic approach in everything we do. Also, in your annual folks, your annual friends will absolutely love hearing that their donors will become more generous. Second, is a question. This is more of a question than a for sure thing, but we've historically said that it takes 3 to 5 years for a person to decide that they're going to leave a gift in a will, and another 3 to 5 years for them to actually make that will. So 6 to 10 years in total, just for like the decision to make happen and then become real. Never mind when you get told. So what has really changed in the past 4 years is the rise of online will making software. We now have tools like Willfora, Epilogue, FreeWill that enable the creation and the update of wills much more easily than it has been in the past. No need to go to a lawyer and pay that expense to make those kinds of changes, particularly for folks with simpler estates. And so we have to wonder if that's going to tighten up that timeline. Will donors more quickly be able to make the decision to include a gift in a will? Will they make that from the time they make the decision to the time they make the gift? Will that tighten up? Will that potentially have an impact on when you get informed, if you do at all? Often these tools have built-in communication streams, so you can find out automatically depending on who you're partnered with. So we may start to see that sort of start to tighten up and a little bit of that barrier to entry falling away or reducing. There are also going to be some impacts on cultivation and stewardship, which Mel will talk you through.
Yeah, cultivation and stewardship really go hand in hand here. First of all, I think we're saying over and over again the length of the time of realization. So this is a longer term relationship that you're going to have with your folks. So you need to cultivate that relationship over the long term. It's going to be very important for them to feel connected and loyal to your cause. You need to stay in that friend zone for as long as you possibly can until that time comes that they're going to update their will. Now, we don't know what that time is. Is it going to follow that natural progression of 6 to 10, 15 years? Maybe is it going to be more like 3 or 4? One could hope, but we don't know for sure. And it's worthwhile to talk about that, how that level of cultivation will require a pretty significant investment in stewardship, because as we said, that runway is longer, 3 or 4 times longer, maybe, than the reflective older will maker. So you'll need to anticipate investing more in them when you're looking at building a program that targets those donors.
So now we have a sense of the context for the reactive will maker. We have a sense of where they've come from. But before we market to them, we need to understand who they are, what's driving them, what's motivating them, what do they hold dear. And so in this section, we'll talk a little bit about what the psychology tells us, what the research tells us about your next gen legacy donor and prospect.
Yeah, we're going to touch on 4 of the core social values of Millennial and Gen X donors, or the next gen donor. We'll focus in on desire for transparency, word of mouth, community orientation, and focus on security today. First, the desire for transparency. So it might not come as any surprise to anyone that next-gen donors don't have as high of a trust in businesses or organizations and brands as their older counterparts. They tend to, unfortunately, group charities in with those businesses and organizations. They look at them in very much the same lens. They've been bombarded with ads and marketing their whole life. And so they've gotten very, very good at filtering and dismissing messages that they just don't feel are authentic or seem like they're just lying or false. They do their research. I think it's important here to mention that that doesn't mean that your next gen donor is any less charitable. I think sometimes some people think that and think that these folks just aren't giving as much. And that's not necessarily true. But the truth is that they don't have the same motivation. So they're not going to give just because they should. They're not going to give just because it's the right thing to do or it's their duty. They don't, that's just not their core value. Couple that with the fact that cost of living is super, super high. And these younger donors have a lot going on. They've got kids, they've got parents, they've got school activities, they've got groceries, they have a list a mile long that they have to budget for. So they're not just going to spend their donations or their charitable dollars willy-nilly. They're going to do their research and they're going to make decisions based on what the charity can communicate to them. And that is, what's the need? What's the impact I can have? And that communication needs to be concrete. It needs to be clear, and stewardship, and particularly reporting back on impact, is very, very important for them. Kind of continuing with that vein, we're talking about the social value of the word of mouth recommendation. So while the next gen donors don't have a lot of trust in brands or organizations in particular, they have a huge amount of trust in their people. So this is also the generation that people call the Google generation. They've witnessed the rise of the influencer online. They are people that post Google reviews and they read Google reviews before they make big decisions about what they're buying or what they're doing, and certainly who they're donating to. They're more likely to donate to your cause because they've talked to a friend or a neighbor or a loved one that has done the same and has had a good experience. So word of mouth is really important to them. Case in point, Charlotte has a very interesting story about Captain Cheerio that she'll share with you.
Sure, Captain Cheerio. Any guesses what Captain Cheerio is? Captain Cheerio is a vacuum cleaner. Captain Cheerio is the name of my friend's vacuum cleaner. In our group of friends, we all had kids around the same time. So we all have 4-year-olds and like 18-month-olds running around. And we were all commiserating one day about the sort of unending battle of vacuuming when you have really little kids in your house. And someone had gotten a Roomba in the group and they had named it Captain Cheerio. And they were like, you guys, Captain Cheerio is incredible. This has changed our lives. This is like a net improvement on our quality of life. So I read this and I thought, well, I'm not really convinced. I trust your judgment, but I don't know. A Roomba seems sort of extreme. Anyway, a second friend was persuaded by the first friend to get a Roomba of their own. And as a result of that, I was like, 2 of my friends have done this. I think I'm convinced. So we now have a Roomba. His name is Barnabas. My children like to follow him around while he vacuums and mops. He's incredible. But I would never in my life have bought a remote vacuum or a Roomba without my friends telling me. The behavior was directly driven by word of mouth. I could not have read a review that would have changed my mind. I could not have had that happen from an ad. It had to come from people that I knew who were like me. And that's the key, is that the word of mouth came from people I trusted who reflected who I am and what my needs are. Yes, Buddy. Buddy is so cute.
I love that.
No, the kids don't throw more Cheerios, but if the floor is not to their standard, they will ask me if Barnabas would like to come out. They attribute a lot of agency to Barnabas. Third core social value on that topic of, the people that you trust and the word of mouth that they provide is community mindedness. What we see in your next gen legacy donor or prospect is a real sense of connectedness on 2 levels, both macro and micro. So this is a group of people who really are tuned into the fact that they are a piece of a system, global system, wherein their actions impact those of others. And in fact, other people's actions and decisions impact them. The most obvious place we see this is with the climate emergency. This generation or this cohort is particularly tuned into the fact that they're dealing with a climate situation that was really shaped by the decisions made by people a generation and 2 generations ago. And yet here we are dealing with that fallout. So there's a real sense of understanding that the things you do now, the choices you make, impact people outside of your immediate circle and also far into the future. So there is that sort of sense of connectedness across time as well as across space. Additionally, we see a real community mindedness on more of a micro level as we see people who are moving away from home. They're either moving towards urban centers or out more rurally where cost of living is cheaper. You're seeing a sort of more broad migration of people. People are less likely to stay in the place that they grew up today. And so they're less likely to be close to family as a support system. And so the need then is to build your new support system. This is where we see, the found family or the framily or the village. There's a real sense of building one's own community with this particular cohort. And we see this actually in Gen X's tendency to volunteer. It's surprising to a lot of people, but Gen X has the greatest rate of volunteerism of any cohort. They volunteer more than civics, they volunteer more than boomers. These are people who, for the most part, have like full-time jobs, and they volunteer more than folks who are likely to be retired, which I think is so interesting. But it makes a lot of sense because, to Mel's point, they're as altruistic, they're as generous, they're as compassionate as their previous cohorts. What they don't have a lot of is disposable income. And so what do they give? They give their time, their energy, their intellect, whatever they're able to that, isn't financial, isn't the resources they need to do things like pay rent and buy groceries. And from a legacy perspective, this is particularly interesting because historically, volunteerism is a great indicator of legacy receptiveness. Right up there with loyalty in terms of giving is volunteerism. And so that's going to be something that becomes very valuable as time goes on. Last but not least, we have the core social value of a focus on security. And when we think about the sort of climate or the circumstances in which your millennials and your Gen X donors came of age, those formative years and what they experienced through them, it makes a lot of sense that they would have this focus. These are people who came of age through the rise of the internet, your dot-com bubble, 9/11, 2008 financial crisis, a lot of sort of chronic game-changing things in a fairly condensed, say, 20-year period of time really influenced the way that these people grew up and saw the world. There is a real sense that nothing is certain, that things cannot be taken for granted. And when we're talking about legacy giving, which is so future oriented, we're talking about gifts that won't be realized for 50 years. It's very hard for this cohort to imagine what the world will look like in 50 years because of how different it looks from even 10 years ago, And so when we're talking about this social value, there is a real inherent need to protect oneself, one's people, one's assets in this particular cohort. This is where we see the rise in the interest in gifts of life insurance coming into play with this particular cohort of people. And it's also a place where we may in future need to continue to lean into messaging we've been using for quite some time around residual giving. So making sure that it's clear to these folks that you don't have to choose. You can provide for the people that you love and support a cause that you care about. So a real focus on security and protecting oneself in this particular group.
So what does this mean for your legacy creative and your messaging? And how do these values kind of intersperse with that? First of all, be real. We talked about the desire for transparency. You need to be real about the complexity of the problems. Don't use flowery language. Tell them the problem, how the problem is created, and the systems that surround those problems. Talk about the systemic issues. So show how your work or what your charity is doing gets at the root of the problem and benefits the greater good rather than just themselves or one small minor part of it. And this harkens back to that community orientation, that community-minded social value. In some of the social ads we've tested with Gen Xers, so some of the legacy ads we've done with some of our clients, the winning copy is copy that speaks to the benefits to others, and it also speaks to protection and security. So how their donation can make a difference that will protect their loved ones and the people that they know. Certainly, you're going to want to talk about the future. You're going to need to prove and show to them that you're still going to be around. Sometimes this means you're highlighting actually your history and your reputation. I mean, you may want to use stories or storytellers that can speak to the trust that they themselves have in the organization, that they'll still be around. And finally, you want to align your creative with the identity of the prospective donor. So Again, we would highly recommend using peer storytellers. So people that are like them in the same life stage as them, have them be the champions of your cause rather than using the organizational voice, which could and probably will invite skepticism or distrust, again, in that brand. Before we move on, is there any questions or comments, or does anybody want to speak up before we kind of move on to the last section of our presentation? Great. I don't see any hands. Okay. Just so excited for us to continue.
Yeah, they just really want to hear about next-gen legacy marketing strategies and tactics.
Us to keep talking. Well, don't say any more.
So now that we've talked through where these reactive will makers came from, who are they? We've gotten to know them a little bit better. Now the question is like, what are you going to do with all this information? How do you put this into practice? And this is where we can start digging into the strategy and tactics you can use to actually get at these folks. So the first step in any strategy, at least for Good Works, is your target audience. And in this case, there's like two and a half that you can talk about. So you can talk about your non-will makers, people who don't have wills at all. You could talk about the reactive will makers, who we've been talking about in depth. And then, of course, there's your next-gen legacy donors, the people who've already taken the plunge. That's my half audience, because you should still keep marketing legacy to them, even though they've made the gift in the will. The reason I wouldn't recommend your non-will makers, even though they're the biggest audience, so we know that 66% of Gen X and 83% of millennials don't have wills. So most of them, they're your biggest audience per capita. However, they're your lowest quality one. Their death avoidance is high because they're firmly in that second act. Their barrier to entry is high because they don't have a will at all. And it feels a lot harder to make that first will than it feels to update a will that you already have. We know that on average, people will update their will 3 times in their lifetime, spurred on by a variety of things: new baby, new grandchild, death in the family, changing residences, what have you. But writing that first one especially feels quite daunting, even with the uprising of online will making software. Still feels like a big lift. Instead, we've got our reactive will makers. So that's 24% of Gen X and 17% of millennials who do have wills. And yes, many of them are reactive. Yes, their death avoidance is still relatively high because they're in that second act, but their barrier to entry is lower. They only have to update a will. And you know that they're going to do it, probably in the next few years, just based on those kinds of life changes. And so these folks are sort of the most natural, lowest hanging fruit to go after. It's not to say that they don't have death avoidance in place. They absolutely do. Theirs is just somewhat lower than the folks who have no wills at all. And then you've got those next-gen legacy donors, those people who, for whatever reason, have included gifts and wills. You might find a lot of widows in that audience. You might find that those people tend to be older in the cohort, and they still need cultivation. They still want to see your legacy marketing because they get that social proof. They see that other people like them have made the decision. It's a great confirmation, a great validation to them that they've made the right decision. And if we want to stay in the will over time, that kind of stewardship is really, really vital.
Or increase their
gift. Yes. Great call. So with that target audience in place, we can then build out our strategy. So the goal, as we've talked about, is get into will number 2 or 3. Will number 1 exists. You're probably not in it, but you could get into one of the next 2. Strategically, how are you going to do this? Well, you're going to create a strong connection between gifts and wills or legacy giving, but you're not going to call it legacy giving because donors don't know what that is. You're going to go with gifts and wills because that's 90 to 95% of plain gifts in this country for the most part. You're going to create a strong connection between gifts and wills, your charity, and the work that you do and the outcomes that you power, and the donors' identities and values. Here, I'll make a side note, which is that you actually don't need to do a great deal of marketing gifts and wills as a concept. Whenever you're doing legacy marketing, it should be related to your charity. There's the incredible power of willpower out there that's doing that heavy lifting for you about the sort of broader education and awareness. You don't need to do that. And for the most part, when we poll and focus group with donors, they think the idea is a good one. So it's not that you have to pitch them on it. It's that you have to pitch them on your charity. It's the best place for that residual, for that gift, that planned gift. So if that's your strategy, how will you play that strategy out? You're going to use an integrated drip marketing approach over a long timeline. What I mean by that is legacy marketing, what doesn't change no matter who the generation is that you do this on the donor's timeline. They don't do it on your timeline. You cannot force them to go to a lawyer and make a will. You cannot force that gift to be realized. Those things are going to happen on the donor's timeline. And so you need to be top of mind. Your charity needs to be top of mind when that time comes, when they make that update. Have you been proactive enough in your marketing to create that strong connection between the gift and the will, your charity, and your donors' identities to get put in at that moment? And you'll do that with an integrated drip marketing approach. So content over a long period of time that builds those connections. The outcome is going to be that when next gen folks hit that legacy readiness threshold, when they're ready to include a gift in the will, when that reflective brain starts to come online, you will be top of mind to secure that gift. Take one of the 4 charity spots that typically exist in Canadian wills.
Yeah, and at this point, you might be thinking, I'm already kind of doing some of that. Certainly if you've ever spoken with myself or Charlotte or seen another presentation, a lot of that stuff kind of overlaps with general best practice recommendations for legacy marketing. Really, the change is certainly speaking to those values, and really having a bigger investment, like we said, in that drip marketing piece. So there's 2 kind of non-optional components of a successful marketing strategy that involves next gen donors that you might not see people or us push as much with that older donor. The first is integration. I really think it's not really a question of if you should use digital channels, it's really when and how. Your marketing, your legacy marketing, if you're targeting next gen donors, needs to include digital mediums. Millennials are very active and comfortable online. I think that goes without saying. They're Googling you, they're looking at your website, they're learning what they can about your organization online. Remember that desire for transparency. They're looking into you. And one of those things is if you don't have a really good website or you don't have a strong active presence, that's a red flag for next gen donors. And just to go back to the drip marketing piece, that's more important than ever with this longer timeline. We refer to it at GoodWorks. You'll often hear us say the raindrops on the roof approach. So it's a strategy that includes kind of that steady drumbeat of touch points over time. So with your next gen donors, that might not mean a huge ambitious legacy campaign that's being, invested in heavily over the next 2 to 4 years. This is more so about the marathon, not the sprint, and investing in those integration touch points throughout many, many years. So that, like Charlotte said, your goal is to be top of mind for those millennials when they go back to update their will, likely driven by another thing in their life. And then they also add on that, oh, I want to include this charity in my will. So again, the key to your next gen marketing strategy is digital. That's not to say that next gen donors won't respond to paper and mail. And in fact, if you are familiar with our Changing Tides research, it shows that these generations are actually direct mail responsive. So don't think that everything you do needs to be in digital form, but they're online. A lot of these next gen donors are getting a mail or a piece of paper marketing, but they're responding to it online. So the mail is triggering it, but they are fulfilling their gift or fulfilling their action online. And the other good reason, or the other reason why you really want to activate those digital channels is, again, you're in this for the long haul. So digital channels can generally be a little bit more cost effective to cultivate people, do those touch points, build your pipeline, and create those kind of stewardship moments. You're going to want to look at integrating legacy-based messaging into your email schedule, perhaps even some social ads, and certainly we're seeing, the rise of SMS texting. So you might even want to consider that channel. And as I just mentioned, given the large amount of research that next-gen donors are doing online before they commit to a gift, the best place to start when looking at this is what can you do to your website?
So back in 2019, I spearheaded a piece of research that combined heat mapping, qualitative polling, and search, keyword research to understand how legacy websites were being used. And we found some really great valuable takeaways that make a huge difference as you're developing or updating your website content. As Mel said, this is the foundation of your digital presence when you're doing legacy marketing for next gen folks. If they are trying to find information about how to leave a gift in their will to you and it's hard to find or it doesn't exist on your website, it seems sketchy. It seems illegitimate. It's a big red flag. And so what we learned through the course of that research is that there are two main groups who use legacy web content. One is the obvious one, the legacy prospect who's doing their research. So that's who we've been talking about for the course of this session. The second is sort of the like much maligned, often forgotten, super important, integral to you getting the gift, advisors who are looking for some pretty basic information to include you in estate plans, typically for a client that's asked to include you in the will. So for those people, the best thing you can do is put front and center your legal name, your charitable registration number, and your current legal address. If you're saying, Charlotte, it's in my footer, feel confident, like I believe in you, you can do better, pull it farther up, put it in a big pull-out box, make it be static down the side of your screen. Because otherwise you're asking people to scroll all the way down all the way down to the page to find that. Sometimes it's not there. Sometimes it doesn't get updated. If it needs to get updated, you move offices perhaps. So really important that you have that key information there. We've all heard the horror stories about gifts that get made to the wrong organization because information wasn't correct or up to date. So please help out your advisor buddies, give them the information they need and make it easy to find. The second big learning we found with this website research was that traffic gets there on purpose. People tended not to be searching for what charity should I leave a gift in my will to or things like that. Instead, they were searching for gift in my will, charity name, planned gift, charity name, that sort of thing. They were getting there very intentionally. And so what that tells us is search optimization is critical. Because if your pages are not search optimized, I can promise you that other charities are, and Google will look for the most relevant, most related things to serve. If someone searches legacy gift and your charity and you haven't done a good job of search optimization, Google won't just say, "Oop, doesn't exist." Instead, it will say, "Here's a lot of other really good options that seem relevant to you." And you may very well lose some opportunity there. So take the time, make sure you're well-versed in search optimization, use your headers, use your meta description. Don't bury things under drop-down menus. That was a huge one that surprised us a great deal. A lot of legacy websites bury things under menus. People did not click them. So make it as easy as you possibly can for people to find you on their website. This also means don't bury your content in menus. So if you have to click like 75 things to find your planned giving section, see if there's a way to pull that up higher in your navigation. And as far as what content you need on your legacy website, in terms of the volume of content, we saw a lot of variety here. We saw people who had tons and tons, pages and pages, and people who had one page. But what we ultimately found was that core content was ways to give. People mostly focused on gifts and wills, but they really wanted to know more about the opportunities available to them. Contact pages or contact information lit up like a Christmas tree on the heat maps, especially if there were pictures of the individual. It would make it look like they had like the worst breakout of all time because their faces would be covered in little red dots from all of the people clicking on the picture. So if you have a picture, make it be linked. But also those pictures seemed to have a lot of engagement because people knew that they were going to be talking to a person when they reached out as opposed to like an info app or a legacy at. So a human being contact is really great there. And then impact information. Videos got watched, content got read. As much as you can share about what that ongoing need is going to look like in the future and how gifts and wills will support it, people will engage with that content on your legacy web pages.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that legacy content needs to be short. We're just really seeing the opposite of that in terms of particularly as it relates to impact messaging around legacy gifts, whether it's online or via print or in the mail or a booklet or a brochure, more is more when it comes to legacy content, and people are really reading it and just soaking it all up, which makes sense given how big of a decision it is, how much of a valuable decision it is. So it makes sense that people would really want to read more about it before they make that step. So the second stage after your website is cultivation and stewardship. And I mean that very literally, when I say your second stage, please don't do this until your website is up to snuff and has all the information that you need, because Charlotte said that's often the primary source of information where people are searching for you and for the impact they can make with a gift in their will. So the website must always be kind of that first thing you're looking at, and that first investment you're making if you're looking at upping your game when it comes to marketing legacy gifts, especially to the next gen donors. So after your website is primed and optimized, then you can talk cultivation and stewardship. You can market legacy giving on its own as a primary touch point. But with these next gen donors, we would recommend integrating smaller pieces into your existing tactics as a secondary touch point. So like I said before, with some of the strategies around legacy giving, you're probably already doing some of them with your prospective legacy donors, your older legacy donors, but the messaging needs to shift. You need to activate those values. You need content that demonstrates authenticity. You need to be real, like we said, be straight up about the problem. Even your videos we're seeing don't really need to be pretty or heavily branded. And in fact, when we do see videos or even some social media content, it's the more authentic shot on your smartphone type of video that seems to really relate to folks more than something that's really snazzy or clean or heavily branded. Because remember, this cohort, this generation, it doesn't glean trust from your brand. That's not where that trust is coming from. And I would also recommend that you think of the COPE strategy. It's something we use often. Don't overburden yourself. Everybody doesn't have enough time in the day. So the COPE strategy is create once, publish everywhere. Take those same stories, the same messages, the same communications, and just put them across your channels, repeat them. People aren't going to remember them. Don't worry if you've talked about this story 2 months ago, they won't remember. Or if they do, it'll be in the back of their mind. You can create it once and publish everywhere. And especially when we're talking about the long term where you need to save costs in terms of cultivation and stewardship, that's going to be really important.
The other thing I would add there when we think about that sort of COPE strategy and picking storytellers that are really identity aligned, and then layering on top of that the sort of longevity of the time to realization, we're going to have a really neat opportunity here in the coming years to have stories that grow with people over time. You may have a certain storyteller who has a great connection. They have maybe a gift and a will already, and they like the story is so salient. And maybe you're going to interview them like every 5 or 10 years, and you're going to keep using that story, and you're going to build that familiarity and use the mere exposure effect to have people really feel like they go on the journey with them. So I think that's the thing that's going to really change, is the way that we're going to be able to use stories for decades as opposed to just for a few years. Last but not least, once you've done the sort of 2 foundational pieces, you've got your website in place, and then on top of that, you've got your cultivation plan, then you're ready to start to really fill the top of that funnel and build your next gen pipeline. That's where it's time to start bringing in new people once you've sort of skimmed the cream off of your file in a sort of meaningful way with email and SMS. Then you can start to go on to meta platforms is where we're seeing the most pickup right now. 88% of Gen X are active on Facebook, and Gen X, being the older cohort of your next gens, are going to be where you're going to have the most play here. And they love Facebook. That's where they're at. They're happy there. They're happy on Instagram, but Facebook is just a little bit more intuitive in terms of forms and moving people off the platform. And this is a place where you're going to be able to serve social ads using segmentation, lookalike audiences, interest-based targeting, or combination therein to identify new audiences. So some of that is targeting. It will depend on the type of organization that you're working with, but often we suggest that the instinct is often to segment very aggressively and to tighten up all your parameters really, really harshly, thinking like, oh, we're only going to serve ads to the best possible prospects. What we find when we run ads that way is that actually you've hamstrung the most powerful part of Facebook, which is their algorithm. Facebook's algorithm, I promise you, knows more about your donor than you do, knows more about your prospect than you do. So if you have told Facebook all the things to think, you're probably not going to have a large enough universe to meet your goals, but also you're going to miss out on all kinds of pockets of people that Facebook's algorithm would find for you. So I would suggest keep your segmentation broad as much as possible and let Facebook do the heavy lifting for you. Sorry, go ahead, Mel.
I just wanted to add that might mean for some of these folks on the call, because Alberta is a smaller province, and if you work in like a regional or a local charity, I've worked with a charity out of Alberta, and we had to open it real wide to get enough traction on Facebook to let the algorithm do its job, and then it narrows down. So it kind of seems counterintuitive, but I think just important to mention for this group in particular, because Alberta is a smaller province, Facebook really likes big audiences, and it won't get the algorithm working correctly until you get the audience numbers up there. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Charlotte.
No, totally valid point. Totally valid point. Because Facebook will find the people who look and feel like the best quality people in your smaller space. But first, it has to know who the best quality people are. So typically, we would use ads to serve some sort of value add or value proposition, a will making toolkit, codicil information, a handout for your advisor, what have you. People would download that value add in exchange for their email address, and then you put their email address through some sort of qualification. We typically do a survey that uses an autobiographical approach based on the research of Russell James, and that helps us identify where in the legacy journey is this person. You will find people out of ads who are like, yeah, I've left a gift in my will, which is the best. So incredible. And then you will find people who are like, I've never heard about this before, but I'm kind of interested. And now you know, great, these are suspects. Let's start to warm them up. Let's put them into an email series. Let's start to drip that marketing over to them over time and move them along the pipeline. Again, this is the step you don't start until your cultivation's in place. Otherwise, you will bring in all these leads. They will fall directly out of your funnel and it won't have any ROI for you at all. So the focus on this, when you're doing this part of it, is on pipeline movement, not on revealing expectancies. That's the really important thing to remember at this stage of the game. That brings us with 4 minutes to spare to the end of our session. We hope that you've enjoyed it. We hope that you've had some sort of valuable learnings to take away that you're going to be able to implement at your own charities. Does anyone have any questions we can field right now? And for the mullers out there like me who will have a question in like 12 to 24 hours, please don't hesitate. Shoot Mel or I an email. Our emails are up on the screen. Message us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you if you want to chat legacy further.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Charlotte and Melanie. I have one of my own. I always am that same person, but I have been thinking about it along the way as well. So Russell James did some research and was explaining that gift in memory in will is actually a really appealing way for people. They want to kind of memorialize some of their family. So I'm curious if we're seeing that with this generation, especially when it's thinking about their parents, and that might be a time when they're thinking about their legacy, that big impact on them. So we haven't necessarily had those kind of marketing pieces and telling that story from a memorializing parents type of thing. But I'm curious if you've had any research or any thoughts on that.
I don't have research on it, but I do have some sort of anecdotes. And I would say we see that gift in memory coming more from the widowed or widower perspective than we do from the parent perspective, especially because what we tend to see is Gen X having to be executors. And so they go through that process. It takes, 12 to 18 months. It's a big headache. They're doing all this legal stuff and they're kind of not thinking about their own component of it. They're just sort of dealing with that immediate thing. So we're not seeing as much right away with the parent. That doesn't mean that some effective cultivation from an anniversary perspective couldn't yield that for you. But for the most part, we see that more with the widow population, I would say. Mel, would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, I would. I would say I've had maybe a couple instances, but again, we're talking older donors who's, I'm thinking of one in particular that their mother made a gift in her will, and through kind of similar to what Charlotte said, through like the execution of her will and going through all that and realizing, how much of an impact her mom had made, she decided then to leave a gift in her will. But again, she was in that kind of older cohort. The other thing, though, that we are kind of starting to see gain traction, certainly in some of the surveys that we're doing or some of the communications we're doing, is just encouraging folks to talk about their wishes with their family. So we're talking to a lot of children, again, in that older cohort, but I think it could expand into like a younger generation too, of just there used to be kind of like a very hush hush about what's in your will and where's it going and everything. And I think we're starting very much to see a change in that. So having folks just talk to their kids or about their charitable giving behavior and what they want to do. And then we're seeing those children kind of grow up to say, well, my parents did it, so I'm going to do it too.
Yeah, excellent point. And you made a point too, Charlotte, about, maybe sometimes this demographic might also be starting to consider things like life insurance policies or, more of the strategic ways to give as well. So I think that's something to keep in the back of our minds too.
Yeah, yeah, especially the vehicles that enable you to make impact now and later. Again, for a group that's quite nebulous on the future, that has a lot of impact, a lot of salience.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So we are at time. We did record. I will stop recording right now.